A little bit about this channel. This channel is designed for Introduction to Bioethics. It's aimed at a college level audience, and specifically we're going to be picking up where our semester left off. So typically in presenting material in this course, I'll present an argument, make sure that we're clear on it, and then we can start bringing in criticisms of it. But even in bringing in criticisms, that's not to say that criticism is right, that's not to say that the original arguments are right. This is not about advocating any one particular view. This is all about trying to create a space where we can have a fair discussion. With that in mind, I'm going to pick up right where our course left off. We had ended right in the middle of the abortion debate, so I recognize that this is an extremely sensitive and very politically charged topic. We're looking at some of the most famous arguments that have been made on the topic in philosophy, and we're going to be doing a careful assessment of them. We had already looked at the legal aspects of abortion. We read Roe v. Wade. We looked at some popular arguments, specifically arguments that appear on social media or in the media a lot, and it seemed like a lot of those arguments would rise or fall depending on your view of personhood. Now we're transitioning into philosophical arguments. Now when we left off, I wanted to map the abortion debate as follows. We have on one hand people who think that abortion is morally permissible, those who think there's nothing really morally wrong with it, and on the other hand, obviously, people who think that abortion is morally wrong. Under the people who think that it's permissible, there's two subcategories. There are the people who say abortion is permissible even if fetuses are persons. So they're going to say, yeah, fetus is a person, but abortion is still okay. And then there are people who say that abortion is permissible specifically because a fetus is not a person. Now, on the other side, people who think that abortion is impermissible, something's morally wrong with it. You have people who say abortion is morally wrong because fetuses are persons, and then you have people who say that abortion is wrong whether you think a fetus is a person or not. Of these four categories in this course, we look at perspectives from Thompson. So Judith Jarvis Thompson represents the first category. She argues that even if we assume fetuses are persons, it still follows that abortion is okay. Next, we're going to be looking at Marianne Warren. She argues that fetuses are not persons, and specifically because they're not persons, that's why abortion is okay. We saw something similar with the Supreme Court. So if you go back to Roe v. Wade, here's what Roe v. Wade says. Wade argues that the fetus is a person within the language and meaning of the 14th Amendment. If this suggestion of personhood is established, Roe's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the 14th Amendment. So the entire case, Roe's entire case, depends on a fetus not being a person. Now looking at the other side of the debate, we have people like Frank Beckwith and Christopher Kaser who argue that fetuses are persons, so we'll be looking at those types of arguments. They think that because fetuses are persons, abortion is immoral. And then lastly, we look at work by Alexander Pruss, and he argues that whatever you think about personhood, it's still the case that abortion is wrong. So he thinks you don't even need to answer the question of personhood. It doesn't matter if a fetus is a person or not. Abortion is still wrong, according to Pruss. Now back to Thompson. So Thompson begins by targeting what she thinks is a really common argument that opponents of abortion give. So opponents of abortion reason like this. If fetuses are persons, then abortion is wrong. Fetuses are persons, and so abortion is wrong. Now what Thompson says is opponents of abortion tend to devote a lot of time and energy to defending that second premise. In other words, they spend a lot of time trying to show that fetuses are persons because they just take for granted the idea that if we can show that a fetus is a person, then of course everyone's going to agree abortion is morally wrong. So with that in mind, Thompson's approach is a little bit different than the standard response. What she does is she says, okay, I'm going to grant that premise 2 is true. So we're going to assume that fetuses are persons. Again, that's not to say that's true, it's not to endorse it, but for the sake of argument, Thompson is just telling us, assume that it's true. With that in mind, Thompson thinks that the first premise still fails. So she's going to try to argue that even if fetuses are persons, abortion is still permissible in at least some cases. So she doesn't think it's permissible in every case whatsoever, but she thinks even if a fetus is a person, abortion is still okay, at least some of the time. So when it comes to challenging the first premise of this argument, Thompson's main idea, the central part of her argument, is that having a right to life does not guarantee having a right to be given the use of another person's body, even if one needs it for life itself. To defend this view, Thompson appeals to 3 different analogies. Each of these is supposed to represent pregnancy in some way, and each of them is supposed to show that even if a being has the right to life, that doesn't give them the right to use somebody else's body for survival. Specifically, the 3 analogies are the violinist analogy, the burglar analogy, and the people seeds analogy. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the violinist analogy. This is probably her most famous argument. In the next video, we'll look at the burglar and people seeds analogy, and we'll talk about criticisms of those. So the violinist analogy goes like this. Imagine this. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He's been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry that the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would have never permitted it if we had known, but still, they did it. And the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months, and then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. So Thompson just asks, is it morally obligatory for you to stay attached to the violinist for 9 months? Her response is that that would be outrageous. In other words, there's no way in which you should be morally required to stay in this circumstance. Now, what's important about this analogy is that the violinist very clearly has a right to life. Nobody disputes that the violinist is a person. And yet our intuitions, Thompson says, seem to be that nobody's going to say that you have to stay hooked up to this violinist. In other words, there's nothing morally wrong with detaching yourself, even though it's going to kill the violinist. Now, this is supposed to be like pregnancy. Obviously, the violinist is standing in for a fetus. The person in bed who's hooked up to the violinist is standing in for the pregnant person. The key point is that even though the violinist has a right to life, it doesn't entail that they have a right to use somebody else's body. The person who's woken up in this situation never agreed to be in this circumstance. They never agreed to let the violinist use their kidneys or use their body in any way. They just woke up in this situation. So they gave no consent whatsoever to being in this circumstance, and because of that, they're perfectly justified in detaching themselves. Now, there are problems for this analogy. People think that it might only work in certain cases, specifically cases of pregnancy that result from involuntary action. Marianne Warren, for example, writes that it's only in the case of pregnancy due to rape that women's situation is adequately analogous to the violinist case. In the normal case, we cannot claim that the woman is in no way responsible for her predicament. If, on the other hand, you're kidnapped by strangers and hooked up to a strange violinist, then you're free of any shred of responsibility for the situation. Only when her pregnancy is a result of involuntary action is a woman clearly just as non-responsible. Hence, the violinist analogy is of much less use to the defender of the woman's right to obtain an abortion. In other words, the violinist case represents a situation where an individual is hooked up against their will. They never made any sort of choice. They never contributed any sort of responsibility to ending up where they are. Because of that, it doesn't apply to most cases of pregnancy, where pregnancy results from a voluntary act. To better illustrate this point, we could revise the case. So, suppose you've got somebody named Steve, and Steve goes to a hotel that's paid for and sponsored by the Society of Music Lovers. Now, when he's checking in, they make sure that he signs a waiver and understands a waiver. The waiver states that if the guest matches the blood type of a famous violinist who needs this blood transfusion, needs to be hooked up, if there's a match, then the guest might wake up hooked up to the violinist. Steve says, yeah, that's fine, signs the waiver, goes, falls asleep in the hotel, and when he wakes up, sure enough, he's attached to the violinist. Does Steve have the right to detach himself now? And it might seem like, no, he knew what he was getting into. He did this willingly. He did it voluntarily. He knew the risk, and he decided that that was okay. So he decided to check into this hotel even though he knew what the risk was. So he's not in a position where he can unplug himself at this point. Now that would be bad for Thompson, right? because that shows that in cases of voluntary pregnancy, you don't have the same sort of right to detach that you do in the involuntary case. So again, the violinist case only seems to work when pregnancy results from an involuntary action. If you think that abortion is permissible in more than just the involuntary cases of pregnancy, then the violinist analogy is not enough. You're going to need something more. To be fair to Thompson, she does seem to recognize this. So she asks the question, if a pregnant person voluntarily calls a fetus into existence, how can they now kill it, even in self-defense? So if it was done voluntarily, you can't just unhook yourself from the fetus. In other words, she seems to anticipate that people are going to respond to the violinist case by saying, when pregnancy results from a voluntary action, you don't have the same sort of right to detach yourself. You don't have the same sort of right to obtain an abortion as you would in the involuntary case. So regarding that argument, that type of response, Thompson writes, this argument would give the unborn person a right to its mother's body only if pregnancy resulted from a voluntary act, undertaken in the full knowledge of the chance a pregnancy might result from it. What Thompson is saying here is the violinist case shows that abortion is permissible when pregnancy results from involuntary action. What it can't do, or what it may not do, is show that abortion is permissible when pregnancy results from a voluntary action. So she's saying, yeah, that might be right. Because of that potential limitation, because the violinist case may only represent involuntary pregnancies, Thompson has to develop further arguments. So this is why she gives two more analogies. So she's going to develop the burglar analogy, she's going to develop the people seeds analogy, and those are supposed to show that abortion in the voluntary cases of pregnancy is still okay in at least some cases. Just for organization, we're going to be looking at the burglar analogy and the people seeds analogy in the next video. For now, I'm going to focus in on the violinist case and talk about some more problems that might be facing it. Another major criticism of Thompson's violinist case is that she doesn't make a proper distinction between killing and letting die. A common moral distinction is that killing is morally wrong. To kill an innocent person specifically is a morally bad thing to do. Not a lot of controversy there. But letting somebody die, that's okay in some cases. In the violinist case, suppose you disconnect yourself from the violinist. You should ask, what causes their death? And the answer there is their underlying kidney disease. You didn't kill them. What killed them was this disease. They already had the disease. They were already dying. In the abortion case, that's not at all how these procedures work. So in the abortion case, there's a direct killing of the fetus. An intentional action is done to end the life of the fetus in many cases. Frank Beckwith, for example, argues that abortion involves the active killing of a human person. Christopher Kaczor echoes this same sort of idea, as he says that unplugging suggests that in causing a separation between you and the violinist, you're not doing anything to the bodily integrity of the violinist himself. So you're not assaulting the violinist, you're not harming him by interfering with his bodily integrity at all, whereas in the typical abortion procedure, that is what's happening. So if you grant that a fetus is a person, well, persons have a right to life, but they also have a right to bodily integrity. And the typical abortion procedure violates the bodily integrity of the fetus. So there's this disanalogy, there's this important difference in the violinist case and the typical case of abortion. Kaczor continues, though, and says, consider the violinist analogy again, with the unplugging replaced by a means of freeing yourself from the violinist that does impinge on his bodily integrity and induces his death. Imagine, for instance, that you are to separate yourself from the violinist by poisoning him or by putting him through an incredibly powerful suction machine. If we were to separate ourselves from the violinist by any of these means, then things begin to look quite different. We're not simply separating ourselves or cutting a cord that links us to the violinist. Rather, we're doing something to the body of the violinist, who, if he is a person, he has as much a right to bodily integrity as do we. In addition, if such violent means were used, the death of the violinist would not come about because of his own underlying pathology. In these cases, the violinist dies because we, or our agents, not only cause, but also apparently intend his death through the various means. There's a lot to unpack there. What Kaczor is saying is there's two really important differences between the violinist case and the typical case of abortion. First, in the typical case of abortion, there's a direct action being taken to end the life of a fetus. In the violinist case, there's no direct action that kills the violinist. Rather, the violinist succumbs to his disease that he already had. The second major difference is that in the violinist case, you don't violate the bodily integrity of the violinist, right? Their bodily integrity is left intact. All you're doing is detaching yourself from them. In the abortion case, though, bodily integrity of the fetus is violated. So if Kaczor is right, then in the typical abortion case, there is direct violence against a fetus's body. And remember, we're talking about Thompson's argument here. So for the sake of argument, we're supposed to suppose that fetuses are persons, right? We're going to assume that's true. So if that's true, they have a right to bodily integrity, and it seems like most abortion techniques violate bodily integrity. Lastly, an important difference between a typical case of pregnancy and the violinist scenario is that a violinist in this scenario is a stranger, right? You don't know them, you've never met them, you have no sort of connection to them, they're not family, nothing like that. Because of that, it's different from the cases of pregnancy, because in cases of pregnancy, there's a paternal sort of obligation or a relation at the very least. So people like Kaczor and Frank Beckwith will argue that parental obligations matter. So parents have obligations to their offspring. That means there's a special relationship that exists between a biological parent and a fetus that doesn't exist in the violinist case. So the violinist case is not taking into account the fact that there are special relationships in play when it comes to the abortion debate. Now that gets really complicated. We get into questions about parental obligations and special obligations, and so I'm going to spend a lot of the next video talking about that. We're going to set that to the side for now. For the time being, I'm going to wrap this video up though. So in summary, there are 4 branches of the abortion debate that we're looking at. There are 2 under the permissible side and 2 under the impermissible side. We've got people who think abortion is permissible even if a fetus is a person, people who think it's permissible because a fetus is not a person, and then those who think abortion is wrong. Some of them think that because they think fetuses are persons, some of them think that because whether a fetus is a person or not, they think personhood doesn't have anything to do with this debate. You can still argue that abortion is wrong. When it came to Thompson, she falls squarely in that first camp. So she's arguing that abortion is permissible even if a fetus is a person. And she builds this around the central claim that having a right to life does not give you the right to use somebody else's body. So even if the fetus is a person, it has a right to life, that doesn't give it the right to use the body of the pregnant person. At least not without the pregnant person agreeing to it or signing up for it. So they have to voluntarily accept the pregnancy in order for the fetus to have a right to use their body. Now the last bit of summary. We looked at the violinist analogy. This is a clear case where an individual has a right to life, and it seems like they don't have a right to use somebody else's body. We also looked at problems though. So the violinist case only seems to apply to a very small number of cases, specifically pregnancy that results from an involuntary act. Additionally, critics argued that Thompson doesn't make the proper distinction between killing and letting die here. The violinist scenario involves letting someone die of a naturally occurring disease. The abortion case doesn't involve anything like that. It involves the intentional and direct killing of a fetus. So they're morally different things. And then also, the violinist case doesn't take into account the fact that parents have special obligations to their offspring. Now we're going to look at the question of special obligations in the next video. Specifically, we're going to look at whether or not parents have obligations to take care of their biological offspring. In the meantime, here are some sources or further references that you might find helpful for your reading, or if you're interested in looking at other content that relates to this debate.